Submission may open you to negative transfer, the transfer of negative aspects of a leader's character, e.g., criticism, adultery, anger, etc., not only happens in false cults, but it also happens in everyday churches that do not understand about the leadership transfer principle. When a leader takes himself out from under the authority of the body of Christ and breaks the unity of the Spirit through pride, he becomes vulnerable to enemy attack. When people submit to this kind of false leadership, they also become vulnerable to the evil spirit that leadership is under. False leaders have a spirit of self-exaltation and pride, and if that spirit is found in us, we will be vulnerable to their false leadership. Leadership has the potential to intimidate those under their authority. The leader must ensure that they do not submit to this spirit of intimidation and control people for their own ends. Those under authority must ensure that they do not allow themselves to be intimidated. Everyone must submit to God, not to intimidation. If we fear God, we will not fear false leadership, and we will not be intimidated by it. Ahab allowed himself to be intimidated by his wife Jezebel, but eventually he repented and feared the Lord instead, at which time his sacrifice was accepted, and he was set free from the enemy's power and regained his personal authority. 1 Kings 21:25-29. Not allowing yourself to be intimidated does not mean that you will be arrogant towards bad or inadequate leadership. If we do not maintain the proper respect that their position deserves, the negative aspects of their spirit will have an opportunity to influence our behavior. Our submission, particularly to inadequate authority, must be because we understand the principle of authority, knowing that only as we submit can we be given authority. Submit as unto the Lord, and it will be the Lord who will give you authority to escape that bad authority in His time. This was what we see happening in Jesus' confrontation with Pilate. Jesus submitted himself to Pilate, acknowledging his position and the fact that he had authority only because God gave it to him. Jesus knew that in submitting to Pilate he was perfectly aligned with God's authority, Acts 2:23, which would give him authority over death, Acts 2:27. God has a work to accomplish in us, and when that work is done, He will make the way of escape, even if it is through martyrdom. If you happen to find yourself under undeveloped or inexperienced leadership, or even leadership whose personality you don't appreciate, or just plain bad leadership, you will be tempted to develop bad attitudes. These attitudes will allow the enemy to download the weaknesses or bad characteristics of those leaders into your life, 2 Peter 2:19. The character defects and the deceptions of those leaders that you have been under in your life will follow you until you are able to bring any wrong attitudes to the Lord. E.g., if you had an abusive father, you will, if you have bitterness toward him, even if it was unintentional, tend to abuse those under your authority. As you receive healing and forgiveness for the resentment that builds up when you are under poor leadership, you will be empowered to resist the enemy and his curses. You will be able to cut the negative power of that leadership off from your life, and the authority of that position will eventually be transferred to you, in the spirit if not in the natural. This was Jesus's promise in his letter to the Church of Philadelphia, Revelation 3:9-10, when he said that those who once abused their authority would come and bow before those who were patient in tribulation, while all the time submitting to Christ rather than retaliating with their own strength. Note that Jesus' words to them were that they had little strength. This was saying that they did not go by their own strength, but in His strength. They did not have an independent spirit. Jesus went on to say that He would keep them from the tribulation that less noble souls would have to endure. Once you conquer the independent spirit, it will be possible to come under God's ordained leadership for your life. Otherwise, you will find it hard to submit to the right leadership. The rebellion that often develops from being under poor leadership separates you from God and from those who God has set in the body for your good and for your growth. If you experience isolation, rejection, and abuse from being under bad authority, particularly from being in a dysfunctional family, you will tend to become angry and rebellious. 3:21, Ephesians 4:9. God has a plan to put the rebellious into good families under good authority, so that He can undo the works of the devil in their lives and build good things into them. Psalm 68:5-6, 1 John 3:8. If this is you, then you will find many challenges as Jesus confronts those strongholds in your mind that were constructed when you were under abusive leadership. God is giving you a chance to build new reference points. Endure the pain, and you will come forth as gold with new authority over yourself and ultimately over others, over whom God will give you authority for edification and not destruction. 2 Corinthians 10:8. Submission and rebellion are mutually exclusive. Rebellion is the opposite to submission. This is why submission is so important. If we are to defeat the enemy within our sphere of influence, we must have an opposite spirit to him. Satan has rebellion at the center of his heart. We cannot defeat Satan if we are of the same spirit that he is of. When Satan comes, he must find nothing of himself in us. John 14:30 and 31. Jesus' submission to the Father was synonymous with his obedience to the Father's will. How will I know if I am operating in a spirit of rebellion? We are operating in the spirit of rebellion if we think that we can bypass those in authority and go it alone. This is a lie designed to keep you in bondage. Don't fall for it. King David, the greatest king that Israel ever had, knew that if he took things into his own hands and tried to exercise his own authority, that he would not be strong enough to defeat his enemies. This was proven to be true in 2 Samuel 24, when he decided to number Israel, a sign that he was trusting in himself and his numbers to defeat his enemies, instead of trusting in the Lord himself. The thing that marked David's life was the fact that he had the habit of consulting the Lord before doing something. This act of numbering Israel was out of keeping with his habit of life. He was not an independent agent. Jeremiah tells us that the one who takes things into his own hands will miss every opportunity for good, and that he will live in drought. Jeremiah 17:5-6. David knew that he would only be able to accomplish God's will when God's authority flowed through him, and that would be decided by whether he maintained the right attitude to Saul, who was over him and who continually tried to kill him. Submission is the same under the new covenant. If a woman has a wrong attitude to her husband, then she cannot expect divine backing in her marriage. 1 Corinthians 11. Paul tells us that the angels will support those who are under God's authority. We will get the assistance that we need when we refuse the spirit of rebellion to have a hold on us. Matt 4:11 and Luke 22:42-43. The man must be under Christ's authority if he wants to have a submissive wife. When there is mutual submission to God and to each other, God will answer their prayers. 1 Corinthians 11:1-4 and 1 Peter 3:7. Because the man is made the head, he is prone to pride. He must not forget that he must submit to Christ if he wants his authority to work properly. If he forgets to submit to Christ, the rebellion that is in him will rob him of authority in his life, and his wife will resist him. If we want authority, then we need to be under authority. Being under Christ means that we need to submit to Christ's delegated authority. All authority is of God. Submission is often the key to new breakthroughs. When we submit ourselves to God's authorities, our authority increases, and we will find new breakthroughs in our relationships, life, and ministry. That which our leader has that we do not have will begin to flow through us by virtue of our submission to our leader, as they are a God-ordained authority. It is therefore our responsibility to ensure that we are under a God-ordained authority. The shepherds will give account for how they have treated God's sheep, Ezekiel 34:1-16, and Jeremiah 23:4-25, 34-38, as they themselves have been given authority, not for destruction, but to build up those who submit to them. 2 Corinthians 10:8. The shepherds are given by the Lord to care for the well-being of the flock. 1 Peter 5:1-3. We are to submit to them and thereby be protected from the lion that comes to devour the sheep. The devil comes only to kill, rob, and destroy. John 10:10. Submission to leaders, as described in 1 Peter chapter 5, is only possible when we deal with the spirit of pride, humble ourselves, and submit to God. 1 Peter 5:5-9. Submission to God's authorities helps us deal with anxiety. Anxiety opens us to satanic attack. As we submit to God's authorities, our faith will flourish, and we will be able to resist our enemies. 1 Peter 5:9. Those who do not submit will find that they are subject to all those things that people in the world are subject to. We find a good picture of this in the story of Balaam. He is a top-line prophet who was hired to curse Israel, but he could only speak those things that were true. He saw Israel under authority and in order. As a result, he prophesied that they could not be cursed, but that God only had blessing for them. There was a shout of a king among them. While they stayed under delegated authority, they were protected from their enemies. No curse would be able to stick. Numbers 23:21-24 and 24:2-9. Submission and dysfunctional leadership. Finally, when we are forced to be under bad or dysfunctional authority, we are tempted to reject the authority and to become resentful. This will allow the evil in that leader to be downloaded into us. We must not be ignorant of the enemy's tactics, but obey God and do good regardless of the cost. We must maintain the right attitude, believing God will give us the authority of the one to whom we submit. We must be careful here too. We must not allow self-righteousness and personal ambition or a spirit of revenge to come in here, or God will resist us. Submission includes suffering. Submission includes the inevitable suffering that perfects us and establishes us in God. Humility is a key attitude. Patience is also a key to laying hold of your God-ordained authority. Remember that you do not want to rise to a place of authority higher than you are ready to handle. If you have not dealt with any attitudes that come along with selfish ambition, any authority that you have will be defiled and will ultimately have a negative effect. The pathway to godly authority is the pathway that allows you to deal with wrong attitudes and wrong motives. God's program of preparation for David was 7 years to test his attitudes and 7 years to test his motives. After he passed the test, he was promoted. Moses stepped out beyond his authority. It wasn't God's time, and it cost him 40 years in the backside of the desert, where he had to learn to submit to Jethro. He recognized God's authority in Jethro, who is a priest of the sun god, even to the point of taking his advice about how to manage his portfolio of taking care of 3 million people in the desert. Because Moses had dealt with his attitude of independence, he was able to discern God's voice coming through his father-in-law. If he would not have respected him, this would not have been possible. Submission opened the door of wisdom to Moses, and it will do the same for you. Give God permission to deal with you so that he might promote you and give you that great name that he intended for you to have, so that you might rule for him in the midst of your enemies. Submission, rebellion, intimidation, and fear. The challenge here is to discern between rebellion and righteous resistance. The fear of man will allow us to be intimidated, so that we do not stand for truth for fear of the outcome. When we stand up to authority, it must be to speak the truth in love, not to defend ourselves and to rebel against that authority. If we do that, we will never have the authority that we resist. If you overcome the intimidation by committing the outcome to God, you will purchase to yourself the authority of the one that you stand before in humility. You cannot resist authority. It will always triumph, but you can and must resist intimidation. Do not submit to that spirit. You must rise up in humility. That sounds a contradiction, but it is most important that we understand this principle, or we will fail to be promoted to a place of authority. You cannot stand up to defend or protect yourself. You must stand up to protect the truth, remembering that the truth is a person, not just the facts. You must speak the truth in love and take the consequences of standing up to someone in authority. You may lose your life or your position and earthly right to authority, but you will not lose your spiritual life or your spiritual authority. What you stand for will be released in the realm of the spirit, so that Satan must yield, even if the person themselves does not yield. Your obedience will release God's judgment in its time. This is why martyrdom is so powerful in releasing the Spirit of God over a region. When we take this stand of not being willing to be intimidated, intimidation comes from the need to protect ourselves. We will often be accused of rebellion. We must check our hearts to be sure that we are not rising up in rebellion to protect ourselves, but that we are standing up for truth and righteousness in love and with a spirit of humility. If this is the case, it does not matter about the devil's false accusations of rebellion or of man's accusations. We must stand knowing that the devil is a liar and that he is trying to get out of the confrontation that we represent. The strongest aggressor will win. We need to be strong in our humility. Humility will always overcome pride. It is greater as it comes from God.